The wind howled across the Montana plains, slashing through the darkness like a knife, driving the sleet against Abigail Zimmerman's already frozen body. Blood trickled from her cracked lips as she staggered forward, her vision blurring with each painful step. The small cabin ahead wavered like a mirage, its warm light cutting through the February storm of 1882. One more step, she promised herself. Just one more. Her knees buckled beneath her heavy skirts as she reached the rough-hewn porch, her trembling hand barely managing to knock before darkness claimed her completely. Ryder Novak pulled the door open, rifle in hand, expecting trouble. Instead, he found a woman collapsed face down on his doorstep, snow already gathering on her still form. "Christ Almighty," he muttered, setting his rifle against the doorframe and kneeling beside her. When he turned her over, her skin burned against his calloused hands despite the freezing night. Her face, though flushed with fever, was striking even in unconsciousness, delicate features framed by auburn hair escaping from beneath a sodden bonnet. He lifted her easily, carrying her into the warmth of his cabin. The storm outside intensified, rattling the windows as if demanding entry. Ryder laid her gently on his bed, concern etching lines around his eyes. 4 years alone in this remote stretch of Montana territory had left him unaccustomed to caring for anyone but himself and his livestock. "Miss," he tried, touching her shoulder. When she didn't respond, he set his jaw and began the careful task of removing her wet outer garments. Propriety demanded restraint, but the fever consuming her required action. He worked efficiently, covering her with blankets once he'd removed the soaked cloak and shoes, keeping her dress in place to preserve what modesty he could. The woman mumbled incoherently as he pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. Ryder frowned at the heat radiating from her skin. He'd seen fevers take strong men before, out here where doctors were scarce and the elements unforgiving. "You picked a hell of a night to come calling," he said softly, moving to stoke the fire. "But you're not dying on my watch." Throughout that first night, Ryder maintained his vigil. Every hour, he replaced the cool cloth on her forehead, coaxed water between her parched lips, and listened to her delirious murmurings. Dawn broke with no improvement, her fever still raging as the storm outside showed no signs of abating. By midday, Ryder had exhausted his limited medical knowledge. He rummaged through a trunk, retrieving a worn journal his mother had kept, filled with remedies and cures collected during her time as a healer. Finding what he needed, he donned his coat and braved the snow to dig beneath it for the herbs growing near his cabin. When he returned, the woman was thrashing weakly against the blankets, her eyes open but unseeing. "Easy now," he soothed, his deep voice gentler than it had been in years. "I'm going to help you, but you need to be still." She focused on him briefly, confusion evident in her fever-bright eyes. "Where?" She managed before coughing racked her slender frame. "My cabin, about 15 miles outside of Caldwell. I'm Ryder Novak. You collapsed on my doorstep last night." "Abigail," she whispered. "Abigail Zimmerman." Then consciousness slipped from her grasp once more. Ryder worked quickly to prepare the herbal tea his mother's journal prescribed, adding honey to make it more palatable. Supporting Abigail's head, he carefully helped her drink, wiping away what spilled down her chin with unexpected tenderness. For 3 days, the pattern continued. The storm raged outside while Ryder fought a different battle within. He read to her from the few books he owned, talked about his small ranch, and told stories of the stars when she grew restless. Sometimes she seemed to hear him, her breathing calming at the sound of his voice. Other times, she called out for people he didn't know, names that meant nothing to him but clearly everything to her. On the 4th morning, Ryder woke from an uncomfortable sleep in his chair to find Abigail watching him, her eyes clear for the first time. "You've been caring for me," she said, her voice weak but steady. He straightened, suddenly awkward. "Someone had to. Storm's been too bad to fetch the doctor from town." "Thank you." Her smile, though faint, transformed her face. "I don't remember much after leaving Billings." "You're a long way from Billings," Ryder said, rising to fetch her water. "What brings a woman alone to these parts in the dead of winter?" Abigail accepted the cup with trembling hands. "I was heading to Caldwell. My aunt lives there at least. I hope she still does." "I haven't seen her since I was a child." Ryder nodded, noting how she avoided a direct answer. "Well, you're welcome here until you're strong enough to travel. Though I should warn you, my hospitality might lack refinement. It's been some time since I entertained guests." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Your hospitality saved my life, Mr. Novak. I'd say that's refinement enough." As the days passed and Abigail's strength gradually returned, Ryder found himself increasingly drawn to her. She was educated, he discovered, having worked as a schoolteacher in St. Louis before coming west. She spoke of books he'd only heard mentioned and played chess with a skill that regularly left him defeated at his own board. What she didn't speak of was why she'd left St. Louis, or what had driven her to travel through Montana territory in the depths of winter. Ryder didn't press. He understood the value of privacy, the need to keep certain wounds covered until they'd healed enough to bear scrutiny. A week after her arrival, Abigail ventured from bed for the first time, wrapped in one of Ryder's flannel shirts over her dress. She moved cautiously to the cabin's single window, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "Untouched." Ryder looked up from mending a bridle. "Most folks around here see it differently. They call it unforgiving. Perhaps it can be both." She turned to him, color finally returning to her cheeks, like most worthwhile things in life. Their eyes held for a moment too long before Ryder cleared his throat and returned to his work. The small cabin suddenly seemed much smaller, the air between them charged with something neither was prepared to acknowledge. That evening, Abigail insisted on helping prepare dinner, though her legs still trembled with weakness. Ryder protested but eventually relented, watching with barely concealed admiration as she transformed his simple provisions into a meal that reminded him of his mother's cooking. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked as they sat at his rough-hewn table. "My father died when I was 14, she replied, her eyes on her plate. "My mother took in laundry and sewing to support us, so the cooking fell to me. You learn quickly when hungry siblings are watching." "Your family is still in St. Louis," a shadow crossed her face. "No, my mother passed 2 winters ago. My brothers have scattered, one to California, one to Denver." "I'm sorry," he said simply. "And you? Do you have family?" Ryder shook his head. "Lost my parents to influenza 10 years back. Had a brother who rode with the army, but he was killed by Sioux in '76. So you came here to be alone." "I came here because the land was available and cheap. Being alone was just a consequence I learned to live with." Later, as she helped him clear the dishes despite his objections, Abigail paused. "Will you tell me about your ranch, what you raise here?" Surprised by her genuine interest, Ryder found himself speaking more than he had in months. He told her about his small herd of cattle, the 2 workhorses and his prized stallion, the vegetable garden he cultivated in summer, and his plans to expand if the next season proved profitable. "It sounds like a good life," she said when he finished. "It's a hard life," he corrected, "but honest." "The best things usually require effort, Mr. Novak." "Ryder," he said abruptly, "if you're going to be staying under my roof, you might as well use my given name." "Ryder," she repeated softly, and the sound of his name on her lips made something shift inside him. The next morning dawned clear, the storm finally exhausted. Ryder saddled his horse after breakfast, explaining he needed to check on his cattle after the long confinement. "Will you be all right alone for a few hours?" he asked, buckling his gun belt. Abigail nodded from her seat by the fire. "I'll be fine. Perhaps I'll see if I can make myself more presentable." She gestured ruefully at her wrinkled dress, the only clothing she had besides what Ryder had loaned her. He hesitated at the door. "There's a trunk in the corner with some of my mother's things. You're welcome to anything there that might fit." The surprise and gratitude in her eyes made him uncomfortable. He wasn't accustomed to giving, or to the warmth that came from seeing her appreciate his offering. "Thank you," she said simply. Ryder nodded curtly and stepped into the brilliant winter sunshine, glad for the excuse to escape the confines of the cabin and the increasingly confusing feelings its new occupant stirred in him. The ride across his property cleared his head. His cattle had weathered the storm well, finding shelter in the stand of pines where he'd constructed a simple windbreak. He counted them carefully, relieved to find none missing. The last thing he needed was to lose livestock when spring was still months away. As he rode back toward the cabin, Ryder found himself hurrying, eager to return in a way that had nothing to do with the biting cold. The realization unsettled him. 4 years he'd spent building walls around himself, creating a life that depended on no one. Now a woman with fever-bright eyes and quiet strength had appeared out of nowhere, and already cracks were forming in his carefully constructed solitude. When he reached the cabin, the scene that greeted him stopped him in the doorway. Abigail stood at the stove, her hair neatly braided and falling over one shoulder. She wore one of his mother's dresses, altered hastily but effectively to fit her slimmer frame. The cabin itself had been transformed, floors swept, surfaces dusted, his few possessions organized with care. She turned at his entrance, a tentative smile on her lips. "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to repay your kindness somehow." "You didn't need to do all this," he said, removing his hat and coat. "Perhaps not, but it gave me purpose." She moved to take his coat, her fingers brushing his momentarily. "Besides, I've been idle too long already. I should be continuing to Caldwell soon." The thought of her leaving struck Ryder with unexpected force. "You're not fully recovered," he said quickly, "and the trails are still dangerous. You should wait at least another week." Abigail studied his face. "I've imposed on you enough already." "It's not an imposition." The words came out more forcefully than he intended. Softening his tone, he added, "At least wait until I'm certain you won't collapse again halfway to town." She hesitated, then nodded. "A few more days, then, but I insist on earning my keep while I'm here." That evening established a pattern for the days that followed. They shared the cabin's chores, Abigail taking over the cooking and mending while Ryder handled the heavier work. Their conversations grew longer, more personal. He told her about growing up in Missouri before his family moved west, about learning ranching from his father, about the dreams he still harbored of making his small spread into something significant. In turn, she spoke of her childhood in St. Louis, her love of teaching, the poetry she wrote privately but never shared. What she continued to avoid was any mention of why she'd left everything behind. Ryder noticed but didn't press. Everyone had the right to their secrets. On her 10th day at the cabin, Ryder returned from checking his fences to find Abigail outside, wrapped in his heavy coat, attempting to draw water from the well. He dismounted quickly, striding toward her with concern. "You shouldn't be out here," he admonished, taking the bucket from her hands. "The cold could set you back." "I'm stronger now," she protested, though her cheeks were flushed with more than just the cold. "And I was restless. There's only so much one can do within four walls. Ryder filled the bucket and carried it inside, Abigail following. Once in the warmth of the cabin, she removed the coat, revealing another of his mother's dresses that she'd altered. This one suited her particularly well, the deep blue bringing out the auburn highlights in her hair. "I found an old journal while organizing the bookshelf," she said, changing the subject. "The recipes inside have been helpful, but there were also beautiful passages about this land." "Was it your mother's?" Ryder nodded, surprised she'd found the journal he'd consulted during her illness. "She had a way with words I never inherited. Used to say this country spoke to her, told her secrets. She sounds remarkable." "She was." He paused, then added, "You remind me of her sometimes, same quiet strength." The compliment hung in the air between them, more intimate than anything he'd previously allowed himself to say. Abigail's eyes met his, and for a moment neither spoke. "I should start dinner," she finally said, breaking the tension. That night, as they sat before the fire, Abigail working on mending one of his shirts while Ryder carved a piece of wood, she finally broached the subject they'd been circling. "You've never asked why I was traveling alone or what I'm running from." His hands stilled on the carving. "Figured you'd tell me if you wanted to." She set down her sewing, staring into the flames. "I was engaged to be married in St. Louis. Edward Blackwell was well respected from a prominent family. My mother had been so pleased with the match." Ryder waited, sensing there was more. "After my mother died, I discovered things about him, his cruelty to servants, his gambling debts, his—" She faltered. "His other women. When I confronted him, he was furious, said it changed nothing, that the wedding would proceed as planned." Her hands twisted in her lap. "The night before our wedding, I overheard him speaking with his friends. He was boasting about how he'd soon have control of my modest inheritance, how he'd break my willful spirit. I realized then that I couldn't go through with it." "So you ran," Ryder said softly. Abigail nodded. "I took what little money I had saved and fled west, toward the only family I had left, my aunt in Caldwell. I wrote to her from Billings, but I don't know if she received my letter. I don't even know if she's still alive." "That took courage," Ryder said, his voice rough with emotion. "Leaving everything you knew, or cowardice," she replied. "Running rather than facing him." "No," he said firmly. "Standing up for yourself is never cowardice. Sometimes running is the bravest thing you can do." She looked at him then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you for saying that, and for not judging me. I'm the last person who should judge anyone for leaving their past behind." The next morning, Ryder announced he needed to ride into Caldwell for supplies. "I could ask about your aunt while I'm there," he offered. "Save you the trip if the news isn't what you're hoping for." Abigail's face lit with gratitude. "Would you? Her name is Catherine Zimmerman. My uncle was Joshua Zimmerman, though I believe he passed some years ago." "Catherine Zimmerman," he repeated. "I'll find out what I can." The ride to Caldwell took most of the day. Ryder felt strangely anxious leaving Abigail alone, though he knew she was well enough now to manage. The town was a modest collection of buildings serving the surrounding ranches, a general store, saloon, small hotel, church, and assorted businesses. At the general store, as he collected the supplies he needed, Ryder casually inquired about Catherine Zimmerman. "Old Mrs. Zimmerman," the shopkeeper said, wrapping parcels in brown paper. "Lives in that little white house past the church. Been here long as I can remember. Keeps to herself mostly since her husband passed." Relief washed through Ryder, followed immediately by a conflicting emotion he wasn't prepared to examine. "She's well then, far as I know. Martha Jenkins takes her meals over sometimes, says she's getting frail but still sharp as a tack." Ryder hesitated, then asked, "Would you know if she was expecting family to visit?" The The shopkeeper shrugged. Can't say. Like I said, keeps to herself. Before leaving town, Ryder rode past the small white house. It was well maintained, with lace curtains in the windows and smoke curling from the chimney. He thought of knocking, introducing himself, explaining about Abigail, but something held him back. That news should come from Abigail herself, not a stranger. The ride back to his cabin was slower, weighted by his thoughts. He'd found what Abigail needed: confirmation her aunt was alive and well in Caldwell. This meant, of course, that she would leave soon. The realization left him hollow in a way he hadn't expected. When he arrived home after dark, the cabin windows glowed with welcoming light. Inside, Abigail had prepared a hot meal and, more surprising, had fashioned a crude cake using dried apples and the last of his sugar. "I thought you deserved something special," she explained. "You've been so kind to me. Your aunt is alive," he said without preamble, setting his packages down. "Lives in a white house past the church, seems to be doing well from what I could gather." Joy transformed her face. "Truly, oh thank God." She moved as if to embrace him, then caught herself, settling for clasping her hands together. "This is wonderful news. I can leave for Caldwell tomorrow." "Tomorrow," Ryder said, more sharply than he intended. "The trails are still dangerous." "At least wait until Ryder," she interrupted gently. "We both know I've been well enough to travel for days now. I've stayed because—" She trailed off, color rising in her cheeks. "Because," he prompted. "Because I've been comfortable here, with you." Her confession hung in the air between them. "But I can't impose forever. My aunt is expecting me, and you have your own life to return to." He wanted to tell her she wasn't an imposition, that his life before her arrival now seemed empty and colorless in retrospect, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he nodded stiffly. "At least let me take you to town. It's safer that way." Their meal that night was subdued, both aware of the impending separation but unable to speak of what it meant to either of them. Afterward, as Abigail washed the dishes, Ryder retreated outside to chop more firewood, channeling his conflicted emotions into physical labor. When he returned, arms laden with split logs, he found Abigail standing near the bookshelf holding a small carved wooden horse. "I found this while cleaning today," she said. "Did you make it?" Ryder set down the wood. "Years ago. Whittling passes the time in winter." "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the smooth curves. "You have an artist's touch." "Hardly," he scoffed, but pleased nonetheless. "Just idle hands and too much time alone." "You ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Choosing this solitary life?" The question caught him off guard. "Never thought of it as a choice exactly. More like the path that opened before me." "But you could have sold this place, gone somewhere with more people, perhaps found—" She stopped, seeming to reconsider her words. "Found what? A companion? Someone to share your life with?" Ryder moved to the fire, stirring the embers unnecessarily. "Tried that once. Didn't take." "What happened?" she asked softly. For a moment, he considered deflecting the question, as he always had when the rare visitor inquired about his solitary existence. Instead, he found himself answering honestly. "Her name was Clara. We were to be married when I still lived near Helena. Had everything planned: the ceremony, the small house I'd built for us." He paused, the old pain duller now but still present. 2 weeks before the wedding, she ran off with a cattle buyer from Wyoming, left a note saying she couldn't face a lifetime in Montana's isolation. "I'm sorry," Abigail said. "That must have been devastating." "It was." He straightened, facing her. "But it taught me something valuable. I'm not meant for that kind of life. Some men are better off alone." She studied him for a long moment. "I don't believe that." "No, no," she said firmly. No one is better off alone. Some have just been hurt enough to believe the risk of connection isn't worth taking again. Her insight, so accurate and direct, left him momentarily speechless. "We should rest," he finally said. "If we're riding to Caldwell tomorrow, we'll need an early start." That night, lying on his makeshift pallet by the fire while Abigail occupied his bed as she had since her arrival, Ryder found sleep elusive. Her words echoed in his mind, challenging the walls he'd built around himself. He'd grown accustomed to solitude, had even convinced himself he preferred it, but these past 2 weeks had awakened something he'd thought long buried. Morning came too quickly. They prepared for the journey in near silence, the cabin filled with unspoken words and missed opportunities. Abigail wore one of his mother's dresses, the simplest one, with a borrowed shawl against the cold. Her few possessions fit easily into a small bundle. As Ryder saddled his horse, preparing to have Abigail ride while he walked alongside, a movement on the horizon caught his attention. Squinting against the morning sun, he made out riders approaching, 3 of them, moving fast. "Get inside," he told Abigail, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. "What is it?" "Riders. Could be nothing, but best to be cautious." She hurried into the cabin while Ryder positioned himself near the corral, one hand resting on his holstered revolver. As the riders drew closer, he recognized none of them unusual in a region where most faces became familiar eventually. They reined in about 20 yards away, dust billowing around their horses. The leader, a well-dressed man with a trimmed beard and cold eyes, surveyed the cabin before focusing on Ryder. "Good morning," the man called, his accent marking him as Eastern educated. "I apologize for the intrusion. We're looking for a young woman who may have passed this way. Auburn hair, petite. Her name is Abigail Zimmerman." Ryder's body tensed. "What business do you have with her?" The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Personal business. She's my fiancée, you see, ran away before our wedding. Her family is quite concerned." "Your name?" Ryder asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Edward Blackwell of St. Louis, and you are?" "Ryder Novak. This is my property you're on, Mr. Blackwell." The 2 men accompanying Edward shifted in their saddles, their postures suggesting they weren't simply traveling companions but hired muscle. "I meant no offense, Mr. Novak. I'm simply trying to find Abigail and bring her home where she belongs." Blackwell's gaze drifted to the cabin. "Have you seen her?" Before Ryder could answer, the cabin door opened and Abigail stepped out, her face pale but composed. "I'm here, Edward," she said, moving to stand beside Ryder. "Though I'm no longer your fiancé, as I made clear before I left." Blackwell's face hardened. "You're being ridiculous, Abigail. This childish tantrum has gone on long enough. It's time to come home and fulfill your obligations." "I have no obligations to you," she replied steadily. "Our engagement is over. I've started a new life out here. With this rancher." Blackwell sneered, looking Ryder up and down dismissively. "My arrangements are none of your concern." "Everything about you is my concern." Blackwell's composure cracked. "You think you can humiliate me, run off with what's rightfully mine. Your inheritance belongs to me now." "My inheritance belongs to me alone," Abigail said, "and I'd rather live in poverty than spend one more day in your presence." Blackwell's face flushed with anger. "You'll regret those words. I've come too far to return empty-handed." He nodded to his companions, who began to dismount. Ryder stepped forward, his hand still on his gun. "I think you should leave, Mr. Blackwell. The lady has made her wishes clear." "This doesn't concern you, Cowboy," Blackwell spat. "Stand aside." "I'm afraid I can't do that." The tension stretched between them, a palpable thing. Ryder was acutely aware of Abigail beside him, of the 2 men flanking Blackwell, of how quickly this could turn deadly. "You're outnumbered," Blackwell pointed out with cold satisfaction. "Perhaps," came a new voice from behind them, "but now so are you." Turning slightly, Ryder saw Sheriff Thomas Miller and his deputy approaching on horseback, rifles ready. The sheriff was a familiar face in these parts, a fair but uncompromising lawman who'd been keeping the peace in Caldwell for over a decade. "Everything all right here, Novak?" The sheriff called. "Just a disagreement about to resolve itself," Ryder replied. "Mr. Blackwell and his friends were leaving." Blackwell's eyes darted between the sheriff, Ryder, and Abigail, clearly recalculating his odds. Finally, he forced a tight smile. "Indeed we were. Just a misunderstanding." He turned to Abigail. "This isn't over. You belong in St. Louis with me." "No, Edward," she said firmly. "I don't. And if you persist in following me, I'll tell everyone exactly why I left, including your business partners and your mother." Something in her tone must have convinced him she meant it. His face paled slightly before hardening into a mask of contempt. "You're not worth the trouble," he said coldly, turning his horse. "Keep her, Cowboy. You deserve each other." With that parting shot, he signaled his men and they rode off, dust billowing in their wake. The sheriff approached once they were a reasonable distance away. "Want to tell me what that was about?" Briefly, Abigail explained her history with Blackwell and her journey west. The sheriff listened thoughtfully, then nodded. "Not the first time I've seen a man who can't take no for an answer. I'll keep an eye out for them in town, make sure they leave the territory." He tipped his hat to Abigail. "Madam, if you're heading to Caldwell to see your aunt, I'd be happy to escort you. Was coming to check on Novak here anyway after that big storm." Ryder and Abigail exchanged glances. The confrontation with Blackwell had changed something, accelerating a decision that had been building between them. "Actually, Sheriff," Abigail said slowly, her eyes still on Ryder's, "I think I might stay here a bit longer, if that's all right with Mr. Novak." "More than all right," Ryder said quietly. The sheriff looked between them, understanding dawning on his weathered face. "I see," he said with a slight smile. "Well, the offer stands whenever you're ready. Your aunt will be glad to know you're safe." "I'll ride to see her soon," Abigail promised. "Perhaps you could let her know I've arrived in the area but was delayed. Consider it done." The sheriff tipped his hat again. "Novak, keep your rifle handy for a few days, just in case. Men like that sometimes need extra convincing." After the sheriff departed, Ryder and Abigail stood in silence for a moment, the morning sun warming the air around them. "You're staying?" he finally asked. "If you'll have me," she replied. "Not just as a guest this time." Ryder took a step toward her, closing the distance between them. "What about your aunt? Your new life in Caldwell? I can visit her often from here," Abigail said. "As for my new life," she reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing his. "I think perhaps I've already found it." Ryder took her hand in his, marveling at how natural it felt. "I'm not an easy man, Abigail. I've been alone too long, set in my ways. And I'm not an easy woman. I have opinions, I speak my mind, and I won't be controlled." His lips curved into a rare smile. "I wouldn't want you any other way." In that moment, with the Montana wilderness stretching around them, and the future suddenly full of possibilities neither had dared imagine, Ryder did what he'd been wanting to do for days. He drew her gently to him and kissed her, a tentative question that she answered by winding her arms around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Abigail smiled up at him. "This wasn't exactly what I had planned when I set out for Caldwell." "Life rarely gives us what we plan for," Ryder said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Sometimes it gives us something better." The weeks that followed were a time of adjustment and discovery. Ryder, accustomed to solitude and independence, found himself learning to share his space and his thoughts. Abigail, raised in city comforts, adapted to the rigors of ranch life with determination and good humor. They rode to Caldwell together to meet Catherine Zimmerman, who welcomed her niece with tears of joy and embraced Ryder with surprising warmth. The elderly woman, upon learning their situation, insisted they formalize their relationship. "Life is too short and too precious to waste time on convention," she told them over tea in her tidy parlor. "If you love each other, make it official. The rest will sort itself out." On a clear spring day in April 1882, with the plains bursting into flower and cattle growing fat on new grass, Ryder and Abigail were married in Caldwell's small church. Catherine attended, along with the sheriff and a handful of ranchers Ryder had come to count as friends over the years. Abigail wore a simple white dress Catherine had helped her make, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Ryder, uncomfortable in his best shirt and suspenders, forgot his discomfort entirely when he saw her walking toward him down the short aisle. "Never thought I'd see the day," Sheriff Miller commented at the small reception afterward. Ryder Novak, the most determined bachelor in 3 counties, taken down by a city girl with more courage than sense to travel alone in winter. "Best mistake I ever made," Abigail laughed, her hand firmly in Ryder's. That night, returning to the cabin that was now truly their home, Ryder carried her across the threshold as tradition demanded. "Welcome home, Mrs. Novak," he said, setting her gently on her feet. "I like the sound of that," she replied, reaching up to kiss him. Later, as they lay together in the darkness, Abigail's head on his chest and his arms around her, Ryder reflected on how completely his life had changed in just a few short months. "What are you thinking?" she asked, sensing his contemplation. "That I never believed in fate until you collapsed on my doorstep." She propped herself up to look at him. "And now I'm wondering what I did to deserve this second chance. I'd resigned myself to being alone." "Perhaps we were both meant to find each other," she said softly. "Two people who needed healing in different ways." He kissed her then, a promise sealed without words. Spring gave way to summer, and the small ranch flourished under their combined efforts. Abigail proved surprisingly adept at ranch work, her determination making up for what she lacked in experience. She started a larger vegetable garden, began raising chickens, and even helped with the cattle when needed. In July, they received word that Edward Blackwell had returned to St. Louis, his pursuit apparently abandoned after the sheriff had made it clear he wasn't welcome in Montana territory. The news lifted a shadow neither had acknowledged was still lingering. As autumn approached, Abigail and Ryder began planning expansions to the cabin, another room, a larger kitchen, improvements that spoke of permanence and growing family. Catherine Zimmerman was a frequent visitor, her health improving with the joy of having family nearby again. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the plains in gold and crimson, Abigail took Ryder's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "I have something to tell you," she said, her eyes shining. Ryder's expression changed from confusion to wonder as understanding dawned. "Are you certain?" She nodded. "Catherine confirmed it last week. She was a midwife in her younger years, you know. A baby," he whispered, awestruck. "Our baby." "Due in spring," Abigail said. Just after the snow melts, Ryder pulled her into his arms, overcome with emotion. Never had he imagined this life for himself, a beloved wife, a child on the way, a future filled with more than just survival and solitude. "Are you happy?" Abigail asked, searching his face. "More than I ever thought possible," he answered honestly. "You've given me everything I didn't know I needed." She leaned against him, both of them gazing out at the land that had brought them together. It's strange to think that if I hadn't fallen ill, if the storm hadn't been so fierce, if you hadn't been the kind of man who would take in a stranger." "Too many ifs," Ryder said, kissing the top of her head. "Let's just be grateful for what is." Winter came again, harsh but beautiful. The cabin, now expanded with the help of neighbors during a traditional barn raising that had been adapted for their needs, was warm and secure against the elements. Abigail's pregnancy progressed smoothly, her body growing round with new life even as snow blanketed the world outside. On the anniversary of the night she had collapsed on his doorstep, Ryder presented Abigail with a gift, a small carved cradle, lovingly crafted during the long evenings of her pregnancy. "Ryder, it's beautiful," she gasped, running her hands over the smooth wood. "When did you find time to make this?" "Found time," he said simply. "Some things are worth making time for." As February turned to March and the first signs of spring began to appear, Abigail's time drew near. Catherine moved temporarily into the cabin to assist with the birth, her experienced presence a comfort to both expectant parents. The labor began on a clear, cold morning. Ryder, banished from the bedroom by Catherine's firm instructions, paced the cabin and yard alternately, every sound from within sending his heart racing. Hours passed, the sun arcing across the sky and beginning its descent before Catherine finally appeared at the door. "You have a son, Ryder," she announced with a tired smile. "Strong and healthy like his mother." He entered the bedroom with trepidation, finding Abigail propped against pillows, exhausted but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Ryder approached as if in a dream, looking down at the tiny face peering out from the blankets. The baby had a shock of dark hair like his own and Abigail's delicate features. "He's perfect," Ryder managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Would you like to hold him?" Carefully, reverently, Ryder took his son into his arms, marveling at how something so small could feel so significant. "What shall we call him?" "I was thinking Joshua after my uncle," Abigail suggested. "Joshua Thomas Novak." "Joshua," Ryder repeated, testing the name. "I like it." As he stood there, holding his son with Abigail watching them both with love in her eyes, Ryder felt a completeness he'd never known was possible. From the darkest night of winter had come the greatest blessings of his life, a woman who had literally stumbled into his world and changed it forever. And now, this child who represented their shared future. "Thank you," he said to Abigail, the simple words carrying the weight of all he felt. She understood, as she always did. "For what?" "For collapsing on my doorstep," he said with a smile. "Best thing that ever happened to me." Abigail laughed softly. "I think we can agree it worked out rather well for both of us." Spring came in earnest, the land renewing itself as it had for countless generations. Joshua thrived, growing stronger each day, his curious eyes taking in the world around him. Ryder and Abigail settled into parenthood with the same determination they'd applied to building their life together. Catherine eventually returned to her home in Caldwell, though she visited often, bringing gifts for her great-nephew and news from town. The small community had embraced Abigail as one of their own, impressed by her courage and adaptability. By summer, with Joshua nearly 6 months old, the ranch was flourishing. Ryder's cattle herd had increased, the expanded garden provided abundance, and plans were underway for a proper barn to replace the lean-to that had served until now. One evening, as fireflies began to appear in the gathering dusk, Ryder sat on the porch with Joshua sleeping against his chest while Abigail finished inside. When she joined them, bringing coffee and settling into the chair beside his, he reached for her hand. "Happy?" he asked simply. She squeezed his fingers, her eyes reflecting the first stars appearing above. "Completely," And you, more than I deserve, he answered honestly. Nonsense, Abigail chided gently. You deserve every happiness, Ryder Novak. Don't ever think otherwise. They sat in comfortable silence, watching night claim the plains, the immensity of the Montana sky stretching endlessly above them. Their story had begun in the depths of winter with fever and desperation, but had blossomed into something neither could have imagined, a love as vast and enduring as the land itself. I never thought I'd say this, Ryder admitted, but I'm grateful for that blizzard that brought you to me. As am I, Abigail agreed, though perhaps next time I visit I'll choose a less dramatic entrance. Her teasing made him smile. Next time. Well, I did collapse dramatically on your doorstep, she reminded him. It worked out rather well for me. I acquired a husband, a son, and a ranch, all from one fever. When you put it that way, I got the better end of the bargain, Ryder laughed. All I got was a stubborn, opinionated wife who challenges me at every turn. And you wouldn't have it any other way, she said confidently. No, he agreed, leaning over to kiss her softly. I wouldn't have it any other way. As darkness settled fully around them, they remained on the porch, their son sleeping peacefully between them, the future stretching before them like the endless Montana sky vast, sometimes challenging but always full of possibility.